Yes. Sometimes it just starts in the middle of, like the David Arcus class, the video starts in the middle of him talking. His jobs. There's the one. Yeah. Great. Okay. Is it recording now? Great. Okay, so we have Chopin, and two Duruflé pieces, Opus 12 and Opus 4, which I'm ecstatic to go over. And Raymond here is, you guys haven't met Raymond yet. He is one of my best friends from School of the Arts. He's a wonderful organist. He's um, just a fantastic musician in person, and he's going to be teaching, I believe, 2 weeks from now. Is that right, or 3 weeks? Was it 2 weeks? 3 weeks? You said, Raymond. I don't remember. You're muted, by the way.
Right. Last.
Can you hear Raymond? I can't hear Raymond. I can't hear you.
Uh.
There you go. I can hear you now. Oh, it's lagging. That's the problem. The internet. You're still lagging. It's okay, Raymond. It's okay. It's okay. I'll pull it up right here. Raymond is teaching 26th of June, so about 3 weeks. Um, but he's phenomenal. He's probably the best interpreter of Vienna I've ever heard. Um, and so he's here, and we're glad to have him. Luke is new as well. He's a pianist who just joined up. So it's our first master class that has a piano piece in it. So I'm really, really excited to talk about piano. It'll be a new conversation, which I think organists especially need to learn from because organists lack so much of the poetry that pianists have, and we can really learn from them a lot. Um, so having said that, for those of you who are new here, we will head over to the tab under the masterclass section. It's one tab up from masterclass audio, and it's called masterclass submissions. We will listen to the pieces in the order, but just one at a time. So we'll all go over to the Chopin Etude. We will listen to that, and then we'll come back into the masterclass audio, and we'll chat about it, and the masterclass will happen. And when we go watch the video, recall to mute yourselves in the meantime. So let's head over to the masterclass submissions and let's check out the Chopin Etude. All right. Wonderful. So, Luke, my first question to you, which I think is pretty self-evident, is what is your vision of this piece? That is my first question to you.
Well, like as you can see, I stuck a photo on the cover. So like yes, so like I think my vision of the piece has something to do with like the sea, probably I'd say like something like the cover photo, which is also a photo that I took.
Mm. And in terms of it being about the sea, as you just said, how do you think that that was conveyed in your playing of this?
Uh, actually, like uh, I just maybe like picture a picture in my head and try to like convey it in my playing, but like it's quite hard to explain.
Hmm. I understand. And because the sound quality um, for this recording wasn't ideal,
Yeah,
but what I heard coming out of the speakers was it was nothing short of extraordinary. You did a phenomenal job, and
thank you.
you're welcome. And the thing that really put it together for me was that you were listening and you were being poetic. You had the I felt the picture really helped in the video personally, and I felt that I could be there in the picture and see the setting that you were trying to portray when you were playing this, and I think that was really wonderful. Um, so it's not often that I get to do this, so it's a privilege, and it's what ensues and then follows this video is this recording of yours is not um a conversation about notes or technique. It's a conversation about the highest levels of music and how to even make them that much better, and or them being the notes and the phrases and the pieces as a whole. And so now it becomes okay, how can we take this from, 95% to 100%, which is in a sense a lifelong journey, but you're already way ahead of the game at 13 years old and being this mature for a 13-year-old, so it's really wonderful. Um, the first thing that strikes me um, immediately once you start the running arpeggios is that it sounds like you want to be a poet and you're doing a lot of speaking and talking and not as much listening. And what I mean by that is that if you were to go back and listen really carefully, I think you would understand what I'm going to say. And that is that the harmonic shifts in the piece, they remained the same color in terms of color palette on the piano and touch. And a lot of times when the melody got down into the lower register of the area that it's in, it actually got subdued in with the textures underneath it, as well as that there are a lot of actually counter melodies and um, really harmonic gems inside of the textures that you can bring out with your thumb on your left hand as you're going along, and you can for example, like in the Brahms intermezzi, you can trade melodies between hands and the inner voices, and a lot of that was left out. And I'll go back in detail and I'll tell you where that is. And the other general comment I have is that most of your phrasing was absolutely phenomenal. But there were a few times where it seemed a bit unnatural and it pulled up too much or it pulled down too much, or the way that the ends of the phrases were tapered. Um, didn't quite make sense. And I think that's a matter of subdivision and of feeling and knowing where you want the pulse to go and where you want the line to go in the bigger picture of the piece. But going back, I thought the first section was great, but the arpeggios I think can be much softer and much more like a ripple. The piece was, in a sense, it was too much like a river in the sense that it was a rapids river. Like it was flowing and it had a bit too much white foam for me on the water. And I think if you were to imagine this piece more like Schubert's Impromptu, uh, I believe it's number 3 in G flat major. Yeah, opus 90. The inner voices really can be ripples. It can be like a creek just flowing downstream. And in the sense of the phrasing, the creek, it has smooth pebbles in it, and it has twists and it has turns, but the water never stops flowing. The water is always flowing. And so the really hard part about this piece actually isn't the technical difficulties of it, but rather it's the suppleness of the phrase from one to the next, and getting the continuity of the river and of the creek flowing. And so getting, first of all, the colors and the textures to be evened out toward the melody rather sings. You can imagine that it's like a gondola maybe on a river just kind of floating down, and as you're going, the melody is what's guiding you, and the in your it's ironically almost representative of that, because if you look at the actual score, all you have guiding you is the melody, and everything else is just constantly flowing underneath. It's almost like he was painting on the score with notes, a visual representation of a creek flowing. But the first part where the counter melodies actually come in for me it's the fourth system, but I can tell you what measure it is. Measure two, 8. It's measure 7 and 8, where the first counter melodies come in the left hand, where you have the D natural, the D flat, the A flat, G, G, and then it resolves back down to the low A. And what ends up happening is the counter melody is traded in measure 8 between the D flat and the B flat in the right hand. So it goes D flat, B flat, B flat, E flat, and then it resolves down. You have the chord resolves down to the C and it resolves up to the E flat, and then the two outer voices go up to the tonic position or the root position tonic chord. Um, but if you listen to, for example, Rubinstein's recording of this, he brings out the tenor line, and it goes in between the two thumbs and the inner voices. And so I would highly consider going back there and looking at that. And um, the next thing, my comment would be that these repeated notes on the second page for me. So let me see, 2, 4, 6, 8. So measure 15. When you have the G's repeating over and over, and we're kind of highlighting this dissonant E flat, E minor chords. The the textures really got muddied there, and the melody kind of ended up blending into the arpeggiations. And so, if you could lighten up your touch on the arpeggiations, and in terms of technicality, you could shift your body weight to your pinky and your natural body weight to carry that melody, as your left hand and the inner part of your right hand are actually flowing more naturally with less body weight, which will naturally give you a softer sound, and you'll have more tone palettes and more of a range of colors that you can work with when you free the left part of your playing here, left part of your body, so your inner and your left hand up a bit, and you relax your shoulders and just let it flow in that section. And in terms of tapering of phrases, a good example of this I saw was the first one was you did it brilliantly on the second page where it climaxes to the two high C's, and it has the D flat in the left hand. You did it brilliantly there. But then when you came back down, so measure 15, yeah, so on the third page, I'll show you my score. Um, sorry, it's from the score is from 1880, so it's a bit beat up. It's the first edition Chopin score. But in this section, let me see here. What was it? This was done brilliantly when you climax the two high Cs, and you settled down that D flat. It was wonderful. But then as the phrase settled back, you had a huge retardando
Mm.
here before continuing on, and it made the piece feel like it was going to end there rather than it was just continuing. And that goes back to the idea of the river and the creek always flowing, but rather not stopping, and being really organic about music and letting it play. And the last thing was that I have more comments in there, but they're all the same thing. It's really a matter of just refining the voicing, refining the taperings of the ends of the phrases, because the starts of the phrases and the peaks of the phrases were often really wonderful, but it was the ends of the phrases that kind of it was almost every phrase you would really pull back, and it felt just a bit like every phrase was almost going to be the end of the piece, and some not quite as much as others. And then the arpeggio runs were nice. Um, Again, I would keep them much more supple and a bit less energetic, actually. I think rather than maybe waves crashing on the ocean as you had in the picture, rather these are the waves really, really far out in the ocean in that picture, and they're just little bitty humps in the picture, and they're just kind of like they're just kind of flowing away, and that would actually get quieter as you go through there. So I wouldn't actually start that pianissimo. I would come into that because you have the smorzando where it gets louder all of a sudden, and then it grows and it grows and it grows and then it quiets. And then, but the quiet doesn't just abruptly come to the pianissimo and the arpeggios. Rather than the quiet, it continues to go until the end, when you have the same for two measures. And then the very last thing I have to say is that when it quiets down finally to the pianissimo at the end, and you have the arpeggiated A flat chord with, and then you have the rest. The tempo changed entirely there, and actually Chopin, in the first edition score and in the manuscript, he never wrote a ritardando there, nor did he write a change in dynamic markings there. So what ends up having to happen here is one has to ask, well, what do we do interpretationally when there's nothing written in there? Because Chopin was pretty much like Duruflé, which is actually a good connection to the two composers tonight, and that he was very meticulous. He didn't have too many mistakes in his publications, even in the first editions. Um, the majority of the mistakes in the first edition scores are note printings that are errors, not actually phrasing and dynamic markings, and written in words like ritardando. So the question ends up being, well, what do you do at a cadence at the end of a piece where you have nothing written? And the answer to that is always what comes before it. And so the end of the piece actually starts with the running arpeggios. And so that's the reason that you keep on quieting down to the pianissimo at the end, is because rather than putting on the brakes, because you had the tempo consistent until the arpeggiated chord, you stop the rest, and then all of a sudden it was actually not even half. It was about three times as slower as the original piece was, or as the rest of the piece was. And so rather than just slamming on the brakes there, um, as aesthetically pleasing as that might be, um, it doesn't make the piece feel like it comes to a natural conclusion, but rather you can imagine this like the end of a movie where the screen is gradually going darker and darker, and that's the arpeggios getting quieter and quieter, and then the movie just fades out and the screen's black. That's the kind of ending that this piece really, I think it really calls for. And so as you're fading out in the arpeggios, you can it really just settles itself without much arpeggio. I can't sing that down that low today because I've had too much water to drink and my throat's cold, but you get the idea, I think, of what I'm saying. Does that make any
Yeah,
sense?
yeah,
Yeah.
it was pretty helpful.
And you, yeah. Oh, I'm glad. And again, I say it, I don't give compliments out hardly ever, and especially not fake ones. And I give no lies when I say that you did a truly phenomenal job. And I cannot wait to hear this piece again when you're 23, and then when you're 33, and when you're 43. As you age, it's just going to get more and more rich, and the contents of it are going to get more and more. What's the word? Um, it's going to get more not rich. It's going to get more and more just full of life and vitality is the word that I can't wait to hear. And it's also interesting in this piece that Chopin is hinting towards the Impressionist era already, especially in his barcarolle. Um, if he hadn't died so soon, I think he would have carried right on into Impressionism because it's in his Barcarolle and F sharp major. The harmonies in there are really Debussy. He even has some whole tone scales in there, which is just mind blowing. The time that he was in, and the period, and the place too. But yeah, I'm gonna open the floor up for comments now. Does anyone have anything they want to say about this piece?
I might say something. I was sitting here thinking about everything that you were playing and that Matt was saying, and on the one hand, it's easy to think, oh, well, I have all these thoughts about, what ideally it could be, and then I remember you're 13. You're not under a shift, and the fact that you're playing at this level at your age is really extraordinary, and it's cool to listen to. I think the metaphors about water are definitely worth thinking about and considering, because water is such an essential visual used by so many composers in so many ways. And the texture of the water changes the character of the piece completely. And it's the same thing as in real life. If you've ever been on a boat in, choppy water versus on a very still pond, it's a completely different experience. Even if it's the same boat, it's a completely different experience. It could be the same lake even, or same river, and on different days it could be totally different. And so, if you're going to think about the aesthetics of water whenever you're doing an interpretation of a piece, it's essential to think about exactly what texture that water has. And I think, I don't necessarily think that you've done anything wrong in your interpretation. I just don't think that it's something that you've necessarily devoted a whole lot of time thinking to, and I wouldn't expect that it's a thing you would have spent a whole lot of time thinking about. But it's worth thinking about. The other thing is that it's interesting that the nickname for this etude, the Aeolian harp. Do you know what an Aeolian harp is?
Yeah, isn't it like a kind of a harp played by the wind?
It is, yes. And it's interesting because usually with pieces that have nicknames, you're supposed to kind of take them with a grain of salt, because they were given nicknames by all sorts of dubious musicologists and whatnot. But the nickname for this piece was given to it by no less of a figure than Robert Schumann. And I would, venture to guess that Schumann kind of knew what he was talking about when it came to music. And I think that when he referred to it as the Aeolian harp etude, I think almost it's important to think about wind as well, and how, if you're thinking about it in terms of the aesthetics of water, then if it's the kind of ripples across water, those are made by wind. And so you just kind of think about the duality of that, and how the things you are doing to the piece. If the piece is the water, then the things you are doing to the piece, interpretationally, must be as gentle as a breath of wind across a surface of water. And it can't be any more dramatic than that. And it's very challenging to have that level of restraint when you're playing a piece like this, to make sure that the things you are doing to the piece are as non-disruptive as a gentle breath of wind. And so I think my major comment about the overall performance is that I don't think you need to do so much. It's clear that you've thought a lot about phrasing, and a lot about voicing, and a lot about kind of these very, very meticulous details. And now that you've nailed those down, which clearly you've done a beautiful job of, now about backing up and stop trying so hard for all those little things to be perfect, and just kind of let it just kind of ease along. It's like wind, across a surface of water. And I can't give any more specific guidance than that, because at that point it's my interpretation and not yours. And you already have a beautiful vision for what this piece is, and I don't want to corrupt it. But that's all I have to say.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that was wonderful comments, Josh. Thank you. Um, Ian, I'm interested in your thoughts. You always give wonderful thoughts. I'm curious about what you think.
Well, the first thing is that I haven't played Chopin for a very many years. So I actually had to go back and dig out my copy of the etudes from the back of the bottom of the cupboard where all my piano stuff is. Given that I don't have a piano at the moment, I just shoved it away. But I guess the first thing was that I listened to the recording without looking at the score because I never played this etude, and I just wanted to listen to it. And just on that first listen, I think I'd echo the points that Matt and Josh had made. That the first thing was the musicality of the phrasing, and the fact that I think you got what the piece was about. And etude is in part a
Wait,
study,
can you guys
and
hear?
they are.
Can you guys hear anything? Because I can't hear anything right now. Oh, I think it's like
Yeah.
lagging a
Okay.
bit for me. I can't hear him talking.
I guess I have a problem. I can't hear anybody else except Josh and Matt.
Yeah, me too.
Well, only one person has spoken so far besides us two, which is Ian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same. Luke, Ian, and Lynn. Why don't y'all both join and leave
Yep.
and rejoin? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
I can hear now.
Um,
All right. Try it now, Ian.
can you hear me, Luke?
Yeah, I can. Thanks.
Okay. Good. Good. All right. Can you start over?
Sure.
Ian.
All right. So I did 2 listens of this actually. First I listened to it without the score, and then I listened to it with the score. The score, noting that I've never played this etude and I wasn't that familiar with it. But I do remember when I opened the score and looked at it, I thought, oh yes,
Ian, your mic is
too close.
rough.
All right, is this better?
Something's yes.
Sometimes when I put the mic too close to my mouth, it's too bad. It cuts off.
That's great.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the first thing that I kind of reminded myself about when I looked at this piece again was what I thought this etude was about. Noting that etudes are studies and there are particular technical points that, as well as musical points to be made. And it reminded me that first and foremost, a lot of this piece is around being able to distinguish the inner parts from the outer parts, to be able to bring a singing line, even though there's a lot of busyness going on in the middle. And a lot of it is around sonorities, and foreground and background, and being able to be in control of all of those elements to give the foreground and the background shifts. Clearly there's the melody, and there's the bass, and there's a harmony moving through, but the inner parts, they have interest as well and coming to and from. So a lot of stuff that Matt and Josh had already spoken about. And I thought you did that really well in conveying a vision of that and a musicality of that. Particularly just from a first listen, I got it, and I got the sense that you got it. When I opened the score, there were a couple of things that I actually have questions around. This is partly because I haven't I haven't been a pianist for a long time, and but one of the things I was thinking about as I was listening to comments as well was a, a lot of the interpretation that you made involved effectively when it got louder, it got faster, and when it went softer, it went slower. I mean, that's very crude, but in a sense, and there is a musical sense to that. But I was wondering whether, as you get more comfortable with the piece and you know it more, whether you can be a little bit less obvious about it, or there are limits to that. So, the example of where as it got louder, it got faster, and the excitement grew, where I thought perhaps you might want to think about being a bit more subtle about it was on my score. It's around score bars 32, 33, 34, growing up to the appassionato. So it's the beginning of the crescendo, and it grows up to the appassionato also at, I think it's like a G flat on top. As I was listening to it on the second time, it seemed to me that you actually kind of you built the tension and the excitement and the like quite, by it got louder and faster, but it kind of, by the time you got to appassionato, the appassionato had already been done. In the sense that after that point, there was almost nothing left to be done. You couldn't go faster and you couldn't get more intense because the control up to that point had been, you put the accelerando button on pretty early on. And then just watching, again, this is only with the benefit of the score and seeing the subtleties of what Chopin has written in. It seemed to me then that it was very hard then to move off that. And because by the time you get to bar 39, it's down to PP. So you're pianissimo now again. And just that section in its, what is written in, I think as you grow to know this piece a bit more, you might want to think about it in the larger scheme of those things. Because he's got a huge dynamic range there, and there's a huge range of passion that has been expended on there, and the growth of that and then the release of that in a slightly larger sense is probably something that will come to you. Now, again, when I was listening to it, it wasn't a point. I got what you thought about it, and it made musical sense. I guess on the second listen, looking at the score, this is where it's not necessarily all about you as a performer. It is also about what was the composer thinking about and in marking in very carefully these things. That's one example of that control of dynamic and speed where I was conscious of it. And the other one, of course, is, as Matt pointed out, at the end, where you go to the lowest dynamic, but at the same time, the speed itself in your performance really did kind of dramatically become allegando to the max. And I'm thinking, following what Matt said, perhaps if you think more consciously about, yes, you can relax the tempo slightly, but still think about the metrical relationship that is written in, noting that Chopin was quite a careful writer on those things, so that the tempo and the dynamic are not necessarily the same thing. There's at a point, by controlling the speed and the tempo, even though the pianissimo is still a pianissimo, will be a more subtle way of conveying the ending. Anyway, that's it for me.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah, Ian, those great comments. I'm curious, Raymond, do you have anything or no?
Being perfectly honest here, I was figuring out the technology, so I didn't get to listen to it this time around. But yeah, so no commentary this time.
Okay.
I think I've got it now, though.
Okay, cool. Len, I'm curious to see if you or David have any thoughts.
Well, unfortunately, David didn't listen to it. He's actually off taking a nap right now. But yeah, so I was also having a look at the score as well. Admittedly, when I listened to it, I didn't have the score open, so I just downloaded it from ImSlip. And How old did you say you were again, Luke?
13.
Wow. So for somebody at that age to be able to play this piece, I'm pretty impressed. I think at that age, I was picking up some Chopin, but definitely not at the level that you were playing it. But my impression, I mean, I really had the impression that it was a very musical playing. So good on you for that. And I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure if I have anything else to add on top of what the others have said. It was, I thought that you had some very nice playing, but yeah, the one thing that Ian did point out, I mean, that was, I did notice that also, that, you know, as you got faster as the, not really the volume, but you know, as you played louder, you got faster, and then as you played softer, then you seem to have slowed down. So you probably want to watch that for the future. But otherwise, I think you did a nice job. So well done.
Great. Well, great job, Luke. I hope that was helpful. English, please. Helpful to you. And if it's okay with anyone else, and if everyone else, and if anyone else doesn't have any comments, then we can move on to Duruflé. Does anyone else have any comments, or is it Duruflé time? Okay, it is Duruflé time then, by all consensus. So let's go to masterclass submissions. Let's hear the Opus 12 Carillon Fugue of Duruflé, and I'll be back here when it's done. Great. So how many of you actually know this piece? I want to ask first. Does anyone here know that piece besides Josh? No. Mm, sort of, Caleb. No. Ian, Jenna, do you know the piece? You're gonna shake your head. No. Okay. Raymond, do you know the piece? You can just shake your head if you don't. No. Okay. Yeah. So no one knows this piece because it's never played. Unfortunately. But we'll get back to that. Ian, as you smirk and lower your head at me. Um, this is an interesting conversation because the conversation comes down to a divisive question, which I have to ask you, and which you have to have an answer to for me to continue. And the question is, do you want me to tell you how to play it as authentic to Duruflé as possible, or do you want to take your own route with this apart from Duruflé? Because what you did, if refined to a high degree, I can imagine working. But it's not at all what Duruflé wanted out of the piece or would have done. So my question to you is, do you want to take the route of Duruflé or do you want to take the route of refining your interpretation?
I want to know both things. I want to
Fair
know
enough.
how, in the tradition of Duruflé, how it is, how the successors, think of it. Noting that, if I understand it correctly, in Duruflé, he was very careful about what he was recorded and what he programmed, and we don't have a recording of him playing it, or Madame Duruflé. I don't think there's a recording of her playing it either.
There is a
But we
recording of
do.
it.
Is there? I have. If you could
Of him
send me
playing
the
it.
link, that'd be. I
I don't have it. It's on an old LP from the '60s in Frederick's apartment. So it's not something I have access to or just on a CD. But I have
you
heard
might
it.
have to. So I want to know that. I also want to know from, again, working with it, and making and owning it, what your thoughts are as to how I can make myself own it. I'll be upfront and say I've never played any Duruflé before. I haven't played much French romantic or post-romantic, apart from Messiaen, and hated Messiaen and promptly never wanted to play any Messiaen again. So, but I'd be, so from that point of view, this was a very deeply uncomfortable recording for me from a number of respects, and it probably showed through. The number one aspect, and I've been bitching about it on the server, is that I couldn't actually record the sound without blowing the levels, and trying to work a way of actually recording it without the sound clipping every, particularly in the last 3 pages, was a bitch. So by the time I got a decent recording on sound, by that I wasn't happy with my own performance, and then my anxiety levels were through the roof, and so I basically just I posted the first recording that actually had a decent sound on it, buggered the performance. And as I listened to the recording again, I could I just I wasn't happy with it, and I wasn't happy, like there was crap that happens in this recording that doesn't happen usually when I, on 9 times out of 10. So all of those things combined to make me quite receptive to any criticism, positive or negative, that can help me get to a point where I feel comfortable playing this stuff.
Sure. Well, this piece is. It's either this piece, the Opus 13 Prelude, or the Meditation that I recommend everyone to start with when venturing into Duruflé. And this is a wonderful piece to venture into Duruflé with, because it's a perfect illustration of Duruflé in that, at first glance, this is probably one of the pieces that absolutely destroys my brain cells the most when I hear Americans play this in recital programs, because it's just da dee da 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 da, and I just like roll my head back over the pew, and I'm just like, ah. I just roll my head back when I hear that on a Moeller Artiste and a negative a second acoustic of the carpet. I just want to roll my head back and essentially end my life. At half tempo too, by the way. But you started at the beginning at a near perfect tempo. I thought your tempo at the beginning was actually wonderful. It was just kind of da-dee, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. And Duruflé once referred to this piece as a jig, which is kind of ironic, because in some ways it's actually quite jig-like. And it's not meant to be a solemn piece at all, even though it ends in minor. Not all minor is sad, as you well know. It's a triumphant minor, not a sad minor. And it's nothing about this was sad. Actually, ironic to the dedication notice to him writing it for the organist and people at Soissons and his friends and stuff like that. He went through multiple cycles of trying to figure out who to dedicate this piece to, and then after he published it, he's like, actually, it's for my wife, not for any of the people I said it was about. So actually, the piece is a gift to his wife, and not to anyone or anything else. Ironically, because Duruflé was like that, but he just changed his mind when he wanted to, and that was it. But in terms of the interpretation, I'll start with the general aspects and we'll work our way inwards. In that every 2 seconds the piece went on, it got slower. So I'm not sure why, but it got slower. And then when the difficult sections came, it got really slow. And then by the time that the end came, it was a bit below half tempo. So it went from a great tempo to a bit slower and a bit slower and a bit slower to I'm now playing Largo. So the first thing is my reason for asking the question at the beginning is here's the thing. If we're talking about this great expansion of the piece into these chiming triumphant bells on full organ at the end, at Soissons Cathedral, have you heard the bells at Soissons Cathedral?
Not yet.
Okay, they're absolutely magnificent. And actually, ironically, they ring at about the same tempo that Duruflé wanted this piece to go. So if you want to go listen to the Soissons bells ring, they ring at this tempo, roughly, where you started it at, which is kind of a good marker of where to start the piece at metronomically. And then in the tradition of Duruflé, and as Duruflé played it, and as he taught his students to play it, the piece is actually, in a very broad sense, a representation of the Vindicator in the terms of how one would play it, and that it starts with this smaller opening, and then it broadens, and it has this huge ending. And you have to be able to get from the first note to the last note, because on the surface level, it's not a very interesting piece, which is ironic for Duruflé, because it is Duruflé. On the surface level, it's not very interesting. And then once you start to go under it, it's like, wow, this is a masterful piece. And so my first question to you is, do you want to slow it down at the end, or do you want to keep it going and push to the end as a climax in the way that you would like not broaden, but just push to it? Because pushing to the ending and having the huge triumphant bells, pom, 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 is Duruflé, but having it broaden immensely and having it a lot slower sounds like it would be more of the Howells tradition than Duruflé, but I could also imagine that being effective if you refined it. So my first question to you is, which one do you think you want to take?
Okay. So I'll answer it by saying why I think I do that, why I get slower. It's because I'm not sure of the aesthetic of the sound that's to come out.
What do you mean?
At the beginning, the textures are quite light, the registration is quite light, you can hear everything that's going on. But as it goes through and you get to the end, and the yes, the counterpoint has basically disappeared. You've just got these chiming bells and the like. And I get in my mind this picture of it's like a sinking cathedral. It's the kind of Debussy kind of impressionistic effect that's coming out. But I'm not sure, and this is where I'm fighting with myself that in my mind it's like, oh dear, you can't hear the counterpoint, you can't hear the details. it's getting buried, and particularly I'm practicing my home organ, so I can adjust the acoustics, right, and the reverb. But even at the lightest reverb, even at the least reverb that can possibly work, you can't, the counterpoint does disappear. Now, if that's the aesthetic and that's the effect, then so be it. Then, in a sense, it doesn't really matter so much. That you can hear all the little bits in the middle happening. I think unconsciously that's part of my brain and my ear translating what I see on the page without necessarily. Well, I haven't had really time to think about. Well, actually, maybe that is the effect, right? So don't worry about the notes so much.
So my first response to that is it's French. So the first thing about
And
the
you're
French
right. I
is
kind of
that
played like Brahms rather than.
yeah, that was more of a Schubert, Brahms-esque performance. Even Howell's more maybe than French. French means more bombards, more better. But the what I mean, obviously I'm extremely heavily like biased about this. I would recommend the Duruflé approach, but I'm immensely biased. And the reason is I think it brings out well, I'm answering his question about wanting to know both ways. And the reason I would do that approach is because, and I have my reasons as to why I don't think your approach actually works in the long run. And that is your approach focuses on the details of the counterpoint. But look at the counterpoint in the sections where you slow down. It's just parallel fourths. There's nothing special about parallel fourths. Why would you highlight parallel fourths? There's nothing special about them. And Duruflé actually isn't highlighting the counterpoint. Duruflé is highlighting the aesthetic of the piece. Duruflé is highlighting the character of the piece with registrations, the slight changes in tempi that you can do. And some people either broaden it just slightly or push just slightly. I think either way works. Duruflé himself was unsure of which way to do it. He did it multiple ways throughout his life. And I think either way works, not to the degree that you did it, because that was half tempo. But as you get along, you can broaden it slightly or push it slightly. But I don't think what you did works, and for the reason of it's highlighting things that aren't there. So there's nothing there to highlight. So I think what your advice to Luke was actually can pertain to you really well. And that is you can just do immensely less with the piece. You can simply just play the piece, because when you play Duruflé, the key aspect about playing Duruflé is that you don't do anything to it. Duruflé wrote his music, and in him writing his music, he gave us all the tools that we need and all the information that we need on the page to play it. And if we allow ourselves to just be a conveyor of that music, an interpreter of the music, and this is where the word interpreter really comes in. If we allow ourselves to just interpret and do nothing else, the music will soar. And I don't mean this in the sense of people in the 60s and the 50s took this just play notion of Dupré to mean play exactly the notes on the page, nothing more. But what they didn't say is play just the music on the page, nothing more. They said play just the notes, not just the music. So what you have to do in this piece is play just the music. And all the music is written out on the page. And I think, depending on the room, you can either push or broaden a bit. It depends on the room. If you're in a dry acoustic, I would say absolutely push it, because it needs that excitement. But if you're in a space like Notre Dame d'Auteuil, where your sample set is, which I've spent hundreds of hours in that space, and I can tell you immediately that if you push through that space with the bomb, with the reeds at the end, in the room, first of all, you're going to want to cover your ears, and second of all, you're going to hear nothing. Not only are you not going to hear counterpoint, you're not going to hear notes, you're not going to hear measures. All you're going to hear is just a wave of sound, because the acoustics are 7 seconds in that room, so you're going to hear nothing. So in that room, I would broaden. So there's really nothing in particular that you did wrong, and there's nothing in particular that you did badly. It was just a holistic interpretational approach that needed to be addressed. Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
and that's a good thing, because you really didn't do anything bad. It was just an interpretational thing that needed to be squared away. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
What are
it's
your thoughts on that?
yeah. It's
Wh-
it's the one thing that would help me feel comfortable with the piece. At the end of the day, I think that's what I want to aim for, regardless of whether it's the way other people played or the way that I work out playing myself. I want to get myself to a point of comfort, or settled in myself, and part of that is reconciling my inner ear with my outer ear, or what I hear, what I hear in my head, or what I think I want to impress, as well as what I'm hearing. And I haven't reached that point with this piece yet.
Mhm. Well, what's interesting to me is that the more comfortable we get with the piece, the more the more comfortable we get with the piece, the less we do to it, and the more we just do what's on the page. So in the beginning of these stages of music, we add so much to the music. We try to have all these ideas. We try to do and force all these things upon the music. But it's like T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, that set of poems he wrote. He says, "In the beginning is my end," and you start with nothing when you start the piece, and when you finally reach your end of the journey with the piece, it's come back down to nothing. It's just what's on the page and nothing more. So the whole journey of learning a piece is getting back to nothing. So the more comfortable you can get with the piece, the more you'll do what's on the page, and that goes for 90% of people, I think, musicians.
Mm.
So, yeah, I would say just live with it, spend time with it,
Mm.
and the notes are there. Clearly, the technique is there. Yeah, there were a few wrong notes, but no one really cares
Yeah.
about that. And at the end of the day, sit with it and think about it, because at the end of the day, it's a great segue into Duruflé, and it's a great piece to get you in the mindset of Duruflé, of just allowing the music to transcend humanity with nothing else added.
Mm.
So,
Uh,
yeah.
Matt, I
Josh,
have a question.
does anyone else have any comments? Oh, go
Matt,
ahead.
before you go on, can
Yeah,
I ask a
please,
question about
please.
edition?
Yeah.
So I learned this one off the edition that you gave me,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
in parallel, I acquired. This is the reprint of it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That I think everybody else plays it from in terms of recordings that I've seen. I
Mm-hmm.
think people play it from the reprint, and it was only after I kind of learnt it from your edition, or the edition you provided me, which
Mm-hmm.
I think was one of the original editions that it was printed from.
That is the original edition.
Yeah.
That is the original. Yeah. First edition.
I noticed that as you had pointed out, there are some discrepancies and differences.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in the chords at the end, right? The big crashing
Mm-hmm.
chords. The
Mm-hmm.
new edition asks you to do some kind of impossible things, like do
Show
legato
me
between
on the
chords.
screen. What do you mean?
Well,
What are you talking about?
in
Oh
those
yeah,
crashing
no,
chords,
that's not. So those
you know,
tenutos should extend the entire piece. It shouldn't be slurs. The
well,
slurs shouldn't be there.
in your edition, those are not slurs and they're not full, three quarters. There are rests in between all of those in your edition,
Right.
and that's where I
Right.
learned. And then suddenly I noticed that there are these slurs in there, and the chords are held over and the like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I can clear that up immediately. So, the first edition that I sent you was overseen by Duruflé himself. Hence Opus 12, it was published in his lifetime. He oversaw the publications for it, and he oversaw the corrections for it. The discrepancies come in this. When the publishers of the new edition got their hands on the original manuscripts, they saw that in the original manuscripts it was dotted and no rest there. The reason Duruflé actually added rest in the first publication of the edition was that when playing this in a large acoustic, if you actually slur the chords and play them as he had written them in the original manuscript, that the chords do not get the impact that they have because they slur together. So, what it should be actually is Duruflé never changed the notes in his original manuscript for this piece, but rather he changed the printing of the first edition to have that edition of addition, not edition, the addition of the things in the score which I sent you. And that's why I told you that I don't use the new score, because the people changed things to be from the original manuscript, which Duruflé had actually edited in the publication but not changed in the original manuscript. So it should be, the slur marks should not be there, and they should not be dotted. It should be the rest with the tenutos all the way through, as you see in the original. Because otherwise, if you're in any acoustic, Saint Eustache, Notre Dame, whatever, you go yo, and just have this mush sound. But rather, and actually in the acoustics, I would actually shorten it even more. If you're in Notre Dame de Paris, I've heard this played there on the Chamades, and actually I heard Latry play it there, and I heard Dubois play this there. I heard both of them, and both of them when they pulled the Chamades at the end, but they said and they played it for one beat instead of two. So it's just bum bum up the console. That's fine. In the room, it sounded like it was just enough separation. So imagine if you do what's actually written and you do that. And that's also another reason that he changed it, because Duruflé was aware of the traditions of his own time. He was aware that the people played exactly what was on the page. And so he knew that he wrote what was exactly on the page in his original manuscript, that it was not what he actually wanted. So does that answer your question? Cool.
It does, and
Does
thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone have any thoughts? Josh looks like he wants to say something.
Yeah, actually on that same subject, and I'll go back and give a couple comments later, but the on that exact subject, you get a very similar thing in Duruflé, especially in things like the end of the Resurrection from the Passion Symphony and from the Cortege and Litany as well. You get these kind of chord things back and forth, and Duruflé uses them differently from Duruflé, obviously, but you end up with a similar kind of conundrum, and that when you listen to Duruflé and his colleagues and students recording it, you get these spaces between the chords, and when you listen to kind of run-of-the-mill American performers, you hear them completely slurred. And it does have to do with kind of performance practice, that when you have these big kind of, I'll refer to them as carillon chords in French music, that are designed to represent bells, because they all represent bells. When you have this in the Duruflé, when you have it in Duruflé, you get the same thing in parts of Vierne. It's all designed to represent carillon bells. And the assumption by these composers, by Vierne, Duruflé, and Duruflé, is that you play them in the room. And in fact, it ties into one of the big kind of American misconceptions about Duruflé. Duruflé, people like to talk about absolute legato, which is a term that Duruflé used a lot. He didn't mean actually tie all the notes into all the other notes, because the room can be your legato. And so when in this particular piece, it's kind of, I think he tried to make it as clear as possible in the first edition that these are kind of what I refer to as carillon chords that should be played as bells ringing out into the room. And so the bigger the acoustic of a room, the shorter those and more percussive those notes have to be. And then, in terms of like the overall piece, I'm nowhere near qualified enough to talk about the interpretation of Duruflé, but I will say one thing. You talk about comfort and kind of not being quite comfortable playing it and worrying about nerves and all this sort of thing with Duruflé. And I think Matt got, I think Frederick told Matt, or exposed him to the way that the French deal with that, which is to perhaps have a bit of wine before you play. But the no, if you want to go full authentic Duruflé mode, but in all seriousness, I think it does come with just time. I think the more you just do it and the less you try and fiddle with things, the more you just sit down and play and sit down and play and just play. And in what Duruflé meant by just play is in, don't worry about just play. Don't worry about everything else. It'll come with time. That's all I have to say.
Just to comment on Josh's thing, there were so many times I don't have enough fingers and toes to count how many times Frederick, when I was in Paris working at Atelier with him, he would show up to lessons with a bottle of wine and say, "We will have this before our lesson." And then we've had the bottle of wine, we share it before the lesson, and he's like, "Now we play better." and then he'd play, he's like, "Oh yes, good." Then Zhang Yu with his beers after he played. Every time he played, he would have 2 beers afterwards. Not before, because he had other things before, but Zhang Yu had substances before, not beer. But Frederick was a lover of wine and still is a lover of wine, so at any given point, he's probably enjoying some wine. So make it more authentic. If when you record this next time, if you record it for a competition, you can have a little sippy sip of wine, and maybe make it that much more authentic. But unless anyone else has any more comments, we can move on to the Opus 4. Absolutely, and on the Atelier sample set. We can move on to the Opus 4 Duruflé and masterclass submissions if no one else has a comment. All right, let's do it. Duruflé Vanity Garage, where it is then. Okay. Owen, how much wine did you have before you played that?
Tragically, none.
I see. Well, what do you... Hello, David, by the way. I see you got your haircut looking all nice and spiffy now. I like it. Was David able to hear that performance?
Yes, he was able to hear it.
I'm so happy because that's the first thing I ever played with him. I can't wait to hear his thoughts. It'll be like a throwback to 2014 all over again. But saving that for in a second. Owen, what? Okay, let me think. Owen, what is? No, how do I ask this question? What does this piece mean to you?
I've been trying to. I don't know. This piece has always been very. I don't know. I've always almost felt like it's had a meaning beyond what I'm capable of comprehending with it. I don't know. I just feel like Duruflé has such a spiritual impact that, in a way, is, for one, hard to put into words, and for two, difficult to even grasp entirely while I'm playing it. So, I mean, it's the text from the Veni Creator, so it's spiritual in that way, and it just feels, especially the final variation, just feels like a cry from the heavens, basically. So that's really about all I've got. But
So, I guess I can start by saying, oh, my camera's off. I didn't realize that. So I can start by saying, what I know to be true about the piece. And so I think in order to play this piece well, one has to have a relationship with the profound. And I don't know anything more profound personally than truth. And so we can both start with what is true about the piece. What I know to be true about the piece, factually, is that Duruflé wrote this while it was raining. Okay, he wrote this at Notre Dame de Louviers. Notre Dame de Louviers is in his hometown of Louviers, and what's special is, unlike other roofs at the time, parts of the roof were being repaired when he was there, so parts of the roof were actually a tin-like substance, so you could hear the rain pattering on the cathedral roof. Secondly, and to take this piece into context, we have to consider what comes before it. What comes before it is a prelude and an adagio. And the prelude, this is all one piece. So notice he didn't, unlike the suite, he didn't break this piece up. The prelude and the adagio are actually not separate pieces. The piece it's one piece with separate movements. The suite is three separate pieces that are actually not related at all. They're just three random pieces that he wrote and put them together and called it a suite. Now, the prelude is the whole ideal of this piece is based off of the transformation of a person. But even more specifically than that, the Veni Creator is a representation of the transformation of a person through the transformation of water. And what that means is that we have in the prelude, we have the rain pattering on the roof. And then we have all these supple melodies that come through. And so the rain, it runs down the side of the cathedral, and it runs into the street, and it runs along the old cobblestone streets, and then that runs out into the creek. And then from the creek, it runs out into the pond. And then we have the adagio. We have this beautifully still, serene pond with mist over it, and the water it's becoming something more. And then from the creek, it runs down into a larger ravine, a bigger water channel, which runs into a lake, which we have this huge flowing into the lake of the climax of the adagio, where everything is just thundering and lightning, and we have the 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 malevolence of life, and we have the tragic elements of life, and we have this huge, immense catastrophe that's like clashing thunder. And then from there, all the rain and all the water washes down, and the wind blows the water back down to the settled place, the settled lake, as we call it. And then we have this exploration of the self, and then the water begins to flow. The water's flowing and it's building momentum, and then the water just shoots off of a waterfall. That scale, it's literally representative of water shooting off of a waterfall and just being in the air, almost anti-gravity for a little bit, and then it falls down into the final resting place. And the person has, in a representational standpoint, the person has grown from no spiritual life in Christ to the ascension to heaven. And but even in heaven, the worshiping of Christ is not over. Hence the half cadence at the end. So we have to consider, from an interpretational standpoint of Duruflé, what he wanted out of this piece, which is the transformation of the person. Which is why it's so mysterious, because the transformation of a human being into a spiritual element is not something that's quite so physical. It's not quite something that you can put your hands on. It's not quite something that you can objectively say with words, which is why he wrote this piece. Duruflé was also going through a spiritual transformation at this time. He was doubting his faith, and then he had a huge, I'm not going to say revelation, rather a huge rebound of his faith, and which shot him right into writing this piece. He wrote this right after college. College, for him, and at the Conservatoire, really worked him down in life, as a lot of conservatories and colleges do. And then he rebounded after that, and his faith was even stronger. So it's the context of this is the transformation of person through the transformation of water. And we can talk about the Aeolian harp etude, the Chopin etude, and in perspective of this, because what we do to water has to be as gentle as the wind, as Josh said earlier. And as I was talking about with suppleness of phrasing and stuff. So, and as I said with Ian, we have to do what's only on the page and nothing more. Because to reiterate for those who weren't here earlier, when they said play just what's on the page in the French tradition, they did not mean play just what the notes on the page. They meant play the music on the page. I cannot say that enough. Do not play just the notes, just play the music. And if we do nothing more to the music, it will soar. And so the more time you spend with this piece, Owen, the less and less you'll end up doing to the music. Now, to start with the chorale, and this is really a perspective for the entirety of the piece. It felt like it was rubato for the sake of rubato. There was so much rubato in the piece that there was essentially no point in the piece where I could tap my foot and have a tempo. And even with rain, the falling of rain has a steadiness. Even rain falls at a steady pace. Water flows down river at a steady pace. And what we want, and what Duruflé wants, and what I think the spirituality of this piece calls for, is that you can imagine a dam, and you're opening the gates of the dam just so slightly, just in the dam, the water just flows, rather than having something behind the water pushing the water and pulling the water backwards. Just allowing the water to just be itself, to flow, allowing it to be like the Schubert impromptus, allowing it to be like the Aeolian harp etude Chopin, where it just flows and you do nothing to it. So for the chorale, I heard Frederick Blanc play this at Notre Dame d'Otoya, and I had the privilege of being downstairs to hear the organ in the room. And during the Pentecost service there, it made me want to stand up in the middle of the service and take off my scarf and my hat and just salute in a way. It was so proud. It was so huge. Talk about a moment when you cry in a piece. You've had this entirety of this piece. You've not heard the theme at all stated, but a few times and only in very small fragments. And then all of a sudden he has E F natural, E F natural, E F natural, bam, full organ with mixtures, no reeds, and just the most beautiful plenum. And it's just so immense and enormous. And he wrote this corresponding with the verses that you put on the screen. And so what I would say to you interpretationally is that not to do all the messing around with the piece you did, not to put all the retardandos, not to put all the phrases and the subphrase markings and all the to say it frankly, all the junk that you put into the piece. You have to pull all that out and just play it like a hymn. That is a hymn, and there is a printing mistake in that title. The description of the piece in the manuscript, which should have been published but was not published, is Andante religioso. Religioso is not in the chorale. Religioso, religiously. It has to be a hymn. And you wouldn't do in a church service what you did to that hymn there, because no person in the congregation ever, including myself, who's a trained musician, could follow along to it. So being able to play this, uh, just stall. You know what? This is the word that I've been thinking about the entire time, and I've forgotten it. Duruflé used the word stalwart. You play this steadfastly. You play it upright and stalwart. It is not something that is an adagio. It's not a lento. It's not a symphony movement. It's not Brahms. It's a hymn. But it's a proud hymn. It's the coming of the Christ, and it should be played like that. It should be triumphant and it should be huge. But the music and the hymn is so proud. It's so beautifully reharmonized here by Duruflé, and it's so just stalwart and upright that it needs nothing else to it, because that does it a disservice. In terms of the first variation, sorry, the canon. So that was probably about a quarter. That was almost not quite. That was going towards the realm of double tempo. This is a chanson. It's a French chanson, and it's a chanson in canon. And this is still a flowing of water. You have to remember the dee da da dee da da jim. We have these triplets here, like the beginning in the prelude. Da dee da da dee da da dee da da dee da da jim. And so, I think an appropriate tempo is one that you can sing. And if you can sing a tempo and you have to breathe too much, it's too slow. But if you can sing the tempo and you get through half of the piece without breathing, it's probably much too fast. So the way to judge a tempo here is to be able to sing the lines, the phrases that are written in on the page, and being able to appropriately breathe at the end of the phrase. If you need to be able to breathe at the ends of these phrases, and maybe you're a trained singer, maybe you have big lungs, okay, take 2 phrases then. Do what's appropriate for you, but in the general sense of things, you should be able to sing 1 or 2 phrases and be able to get through it as a singer should appropriately. So hence, the general consensus of tempo for this, including the matured tempo of Duruflé, was roughly around it's just like I can picture the water flowing through and again, not so much to it. It was so much rubato and so much phrasing and so much extra. And you also broke several notes in there which weren't actually in the score. And one of the notes, I think it was the repeated G sharp or F sharp. I actually left my score at my church. So I'm trying to remember. I think it's a G sharp. You played it as a 16th note or a triplet and then just released it, and it had a huge space between it coming back down. But it's important to remember that not only should you be singing the melody, you should be singing the other melody. We have 2 melodies here. And this is really a duet between a soprano and a tenor. And we have the accompaniment in the middle, this like gondola like flowing down the river, just and then you were singing, even though you had a lot of rubato, you were still singing. You're making an effort to sing the top voice. But the bottom voice in the pedals, it was very metronomic. It was just it was very just rigid. And it has to sing too. And that's the hardest part about the variations, is that there's so much detail and there's so much singing within the inner parts of the variations and within the interior of the musical structure that's often not brought out, which makes it ascend to that much, much higher level. So my comment to you about the first variation would be that it has to sing. It has to sing not only in the top, it has to sing in the bottom, And also, the center, it needs to be legato. There were several places where I think your fingering got kind of a little bit whack or loose, and it ended up causing things to break in the interior. And also, there's some hard stretches in there because you have notes tied. You have half notes and quarter notes. They're tied in the middle of the triplets with your left hand. You're having to like do all sorts of contractions with your left hand to get it up to fit everywhere. And I'm not sure how big your hands are, but you seem like a pretty tall, lanky guy like myself. So I assume you have relative hands. You have decent sized hands, don't you? Yeah, I thought so. So
I'd say
I saw you
so.
play the
Yeah,
Franc or B minor
I'm
chorale, and you didn't have any
6'4". Yeah.
trouble. Yeah, okay, you're 6'4" and you have hands. And you had no problem playing the B minor chorale that time, so you should be able to work it out. I'm happy to
Yeah.
send you my fingerings. In my score, I have copies of Duruflé's fingerings, I have Frederick's fingerings, and I also have my own fingerings. So there's 3 sets of fingerings in my score that I could scan to you, which I'm happy to send. As well as I have all the
All right.
corrections and the additions in my editions from Duruflé. But make
That
sure
would
that all
certainly
the
be
interior
helpful.
voices are connected. And yeah, and I'll send it to you. And there's also some
Okay.
legato, and there's some counter melody in that interior voice that needs to be really refined as well. And don't forget to sing in the pedal. The triplet variation 3 against 2, it's not much to talk about there. Again, some of what ended up happening is some of the left hand ended up becoming dotted triplets. So some of the left hand ended up becoming what you would see on the page as 2 notes with a stemmed quarter note and a flagged eighth note, and I had a bar of it saying 3, and it ended up becoming instead of bum 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 bum, it ended up becoming dim bum 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 bum, because some of it started to fall in line with the right hand triplets rather than being a really solid 3 against 2. So I would say really make sure that your 3 against 2 is solid there. As well as that, it sounded like you were a little bit stressed out playing that variation. I know it stresses me out sometimes playing that variation, especially when I have tough actions or way too light actions. But the most important thing about this variation is that it seems that it calls for a bit of infancy, a bit of innocence and childlike, because there's something even. It's so important to remember that even in a spiritual relationship with Christ, there's a bit of childlike intimacy there, the father and the son relationship, and this is really the son. This is the intimacy of the son being represented through this playfulness of water and the playfulness of the development of the person. So it can lighten up a bit. The tempo, I think, can just very subtly, very lightly, very gently just settle a little bit. It can relax and it can just flow, just like the beginning of the prelude, just like the adagio, and just like the variations before this. It can just flow. Dim bom bom dim dee da da dee da da dee da da dee da dee da pum. And actually, there isn't that much tempo variation in between the 2 variations. The one before this, the canon, and this one, the 3 against 2, dim bom dee da dee dum. There's not too much tempo variation there. It's not the same, but it's not too far off. It's like the relationship in the Bach E minor prelude fugue, the wedge. He sets the tempo for the fugue in the prelude. So you have the tempo relationship all through the chorale, and more or less the chant itself should be the center for the tempo, and then you can either go up or down a little bit from there. The adagio variation, which is actually andante, um, there were some really lovely qualities to it, but the rubato and the phrasing became so uneven that it felt lopsided to me a lot of places, and I wasn't quite sure where it was going. It also felt a tad bit on the rushed and pressed side. Um, and he doesn't say andantino; he says andante, so it's gentle walking. And it's also in the original score, it was andante cantabile, singing. And there's not much you do to the piece because it's so beautiful and it's such. This is the mark of a masterful composer who's absolutely given a divine ability to where you can be able to play this and it sings so beautifully and so naturally by itself without having to do anything. It comes back down to the essence of Duruflé of just playing what's on the page, playing the music that he's already so fortunately giving us. So I would say the tempo, your first 3 or 4 notes wasn't too far off in terms of tempo. I think it was a pretty reasonable tempo, but the brakes, I mean, not the brakes, the acceleration hit, and then you slammed on the brake pedal, and then it accelerated, then it slammed on the brake pedal again, and then you slammed on the brake pedal like a second time, then you accelerated it again. In terms of rubato, it kept jumping forwards and backwards, and I wasn't sure if you were trying to run a red light in a car or what was happening, but it needs to kind of just it needs to flow like water. So a relative tempo for that would be, again, like the other variation, if you can sing it and you can sing the entirety of the longevity of the phrase, it's probably a good tempo. Which ends up coming to roughly around G da G da G da dum G dum bum G dum. And what's really important about this, the most overlooked feature in this adagio, in this andante movement, is the releases of the repeated notes. It is by far the most overlooked detail of this thing, because if you release, even on an electric action organ, if you release with your foot that I believe it's a high D, I don't have the score in front of me, the first end of the phrase, bom, be, dom, it is a D, it's a D to an A, dee, dom, that bom, bom. If you don't release that right, it comes in too early, it comes in too late, it messes up the longevity of the phrase. So having a really important release here, having a really good release here is so critical to the musicality of the piece. And I can tell you how to achieve that. You can achieve that by not releasing with your ankle. If you release the pedal with your ankle, 100% of the time it will be cut. It will not be smooth because you do not have as many muscles or tendons or nerve control in your ankle as you do your entirety of your leg. If you release from the hip, and so if you're sitting back, I don't know if I can relate to this. Yeah, I can't really show you this in sitting on masterclass and Discord, unfortunately. But if you have your leg here, say like, how do I do this? This is your leg here, and instead of releasing like from your ankle here and doing this, yeah, that's fine. So instead of doing this with your ankle, that's how it sounded. It sounded like you were kind of pulling up with your ankle. You can release from your. Let's take this off because you can see the red shirt probably better. Instead of releasing from here and doing this with the pedal, if you release from here, this stays relaxed and this allows the pedal to supplely come up, and then you can depress the pedal again very gently. And so you're allowing the pipe to finish the resonation of that note and allowing it to fully speak and give the value of that note fully, and then breathe and then come back in. And a good way to judge this too is play it as you're singing the pedal melody. Because if you can play the pedal melody as you're singing it and take these appropriate breaths, this warrants breath. It's a chanson. It's a French chanson, and it requires that human quality to it because we're speaking of humans. We're speaking of humans, and we're speaking of water, and we're speaking of spirituality. And all three things require time. They take time, and they have breath. Spirituality takes time to grow. It has breath. Water takes time to flow into its resting place, and humans take time to develop. It requires time. Time to breathe, time to maturate, time to just be. So let it settle. Let the technicality of it not be a problem. Make sure that you release from the knee and from the hip, but not the ankle, to give it that really smooth release and allow it to settle at the end. The retardando at the end felt I can't remember now because I'm storing so much information in my head trying to like talk about all the variations without the score. If I recall correctly, it seemed a bit like I didn't know what was happening. Same as the Chopin etude. The breaks kind of hit, if I recall correctly, and rather than the breaks just all of a sudden out of nowhere coming on, if you were to subdivide that and let it flow out again, like the arpeggios in the Chopin etude, it just kind of flows out. The screen is getting more and more distant. The screen is getting more and more black. The movie screen is kind of going away now. So keep that gentillesse, that suppleness of just allowing it to kind of just die out naturally. And yeah, that's what I have to say about that. The final variation, the toccata, my first thing about this was I would say you have to look at what's on the page because there's so much written on the page that you actually didn't do. The first thing that you didn't do is the markings that he wrote for the triplets and the first two systems of the piece. The left hand is playing the chant melody, and he has tenutos over that, and he has staccato markings over the other two right-hand accompaniment notes. And now, no, it's not a quarter note. It should not be held over into the F sharp. It should not be held over to the next note, but it should have weight to it. If I remember correctly, Frederick Blanc's wording about this was that I should be able to hear. This is not at all related directly to the piece, but it gives you a good atmospheric helper. That's what I call it, at least an atmospheric helper. And the atmosphere that Frederick gave me for this is that I should be able to hear Napoleon's horses galloping in the battle. Like the Lord's coming back. We're ready to party. Let's go. You know, we're going. This isn't the game anymore.
Because to someone like Frederick,
and it didn't have that. It just sounded like a big legato.
Yeah, to someone
say Napoleon.
No, yeah, to someone like Frederick, spirituality equals invading Germany.
It does. Frederick's spirituality is whine and invade Germany because French. But you have to be able to give Napoleon those horses. I mean, I think at that point Napoleon was drowning in quicksand. He wasn't so much going to Germany but drowning. So make sure that it's not legato and that it has that drive, and that the right hand is separated, and then the left hand really carries the chant melody along. Now the next question comes up until the chords come, which is the canon section of this, which lasts about a page and a half. And my thing is that in this recording, well, the debate about this is, okay, should we play this all the time legato? Like the interior, the triplets in the left hand and the right hand that you're trading back and forth. Should they be legato all the time? Should they be more of a Baroque legato, which, hold on, that has an argument? Or should it be more of a mid-ground, kind of right in the center of both of those? And there is no correct answer to that. And the reason is it depends on the room, it depends on the organ, it depends on the speech of the stops you're using, and it depends on actually your technique and how I guess how well that it is of your ability to play it, how well you can play this piece, how well you know it. You know it well, so that's not a problem. So we can put that aside. But the organ seems to me that it speaks rather slowly and that the room is a little bit echoey. At least it gives me that impression from your recording. So in your recording, and that's all I can judge it off of, is that, and this happens to a lot of performers, is that those triplets are so exciting and they get lost in the room. They get lost in the back of the room, they get lost in recordings, and they shouldn't get lost. The triplets are what's carrying the energy. The triplets are carrying the same energy from the introduction, the galloping horses. They're carrying that right through to the water shooting off the waterfall with the scale at the end. And if we don't have that, we don't have that, we lose all the energy. And in the recording, it became kind of mushy. It was really, really echoey. And I don't actually think it was recording quality because I was watching you play it, and when I was watching you play it, the notes actually were overlapping more than I would do so. So I would make sure that those notes do not overlap in that acoustic. Now, if I was playing a Moeller artiste in a fully carpeted room, I would probably play it pretty darn legato, but I'm not, and you weren't either. You're playing it in a pretty reverberant space on an organ that speaks relatively slowly and has broad-scaled pipes. I would absolutely articulate those much more. Now, not staccato. They're not staccato. They are legato to the point of them being smooth but energetic in the room. Not legato at the console, legato in the room. And legato in this piece also comes with the word energetic, especially in this movement. Moving on, less rubato still. Had a lot of rubato. It was so much rubato. It was so much rubato. I would cut all of that out and just play it as is. And by the way, a technicality thing. If you want to achieve a better sense of the piece, take a metronome to it and play it for probably literally a week. Now you can and don't do anything to it. Make it your absolute goal to do nothing to the piece and play just the notes. Play everything rigidly, because that'll set you back a lot. And a lot of times what happens is when you finish your metronome gorge, as I call it, it ends up putting you closer to the center, closer to where the actual appropriate amount of what you need to do, where that is. So I would say metronome practice, metronome practice, metronome practice. Get it more solid so that when you do the slight additions, it becomes so much more beautiful and so much more profound. And my last things are the chords. It slow down. It slowed down a lot. When you have the chord section, I mean, when the 16-foot board comes on, and then when the mixtures come on, it slowed down, and then it really slowed down. And then when you have the flowing of the water, that's the river, and the river is opening up. It's a huge river. That's like one of those National Geographic films where the camera's in the air and it's just pulling back the picture on the screen, and you see this immense river. Like we've gone from mosquito in here. We've gone from the small pattering of raindrops to this immense, grand, beautiful river. And you see at the end Niagara Falls, and we're approaching Niagara Falls, but it's not a rushing. It's not a we're excited. It's like we're finally accepting it, and we're here. And so while yes, it can broaden a little bit, absolutely, it doesn't need to be half tempo from the beginning. So it's still and you can fill the section. One of the misprints in this too was that this section should feel like it's in half tempo. This section should actually be written in cut tempo. Pom, pim, pom, pom. Because in the pedals we have two half notes. We have a B flat in the left foot, but in the right foot we have F half note, G half note. Pom, 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 ba da dee da da dee da da dee, pom, pom. And that feeling the half note pulse really allows us to broaden as we get to that scale, and finally to this beautiful harmonization of the scale, which we have, the chorale, which we have at the end. And then so my next thing is the scale. The scale into the end, it just didn't work because you stopped. And it just, nothing about that at all was. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. It sounds kind of brutal, but nothing about that at all was anything remotely close to how in terms of Duruflé, in terms of the tradition of Duruflé, not counting personal interpretation. The tradition of Duruflé, it was not at all how it would have been done. And I can tell you why I don't think interpretationally it makes sense. And that is being consistent with the idea of water. Water doesn't stop. Water doesn't just stop in midair. It doesn't stop anywhere. We have pebbles, the creek turns left and right, but it's still one piece and it's still one phrase. It's still one thing. And I can tell you another reason why. If you do what you did, it makes the scale the climax and not the notes afterward. Because you did so much to the scale that the scale became the climax of the piece and not the chorale. But the entirety of the piece goes to the chorale at the end. And that huge dominant seventh chord is our goal. And so, rather than making the scale the climax and stopping on the scale, the ritardando, if you look at the piece, continues to the chorale. It does not stop on the scale, and the a tempo is not on the scale. The scale is a piacere, is what it says. It goes through the scale, through to the chorale. And the reason this is a piacere is because it's an at liberty scale. It's not a measured. I think it's 9 or 10. It's not a measured scale that should fit into one beat. It is just this ascension, this anti-gravity lift in a sense off of a waterfall, to where for that first chord of the piece, we should be able to feel that anti-gravity, that sense of gloriousness, of just being one with the creator, one with spirituality, being ascended off into mid-air and just like flying for a bit, and then finally become grounded again. And then for there, again, just less rubato, more like you're playing the first variation, not the first, the theme of the variation is the hymn. And yeah, That's what I say about it. And then the end, you can take more time with the end. And that last C sharp, the A to the C sharp before the E major chord at the end. However, whatever notes are, I don't remember. It's an A and a C sharp into that. You can take more time on there because it's a huge piece concluding, and you can really take a huge entendre to that and really stretch that C sharp as far as possible without breaking the elastic band, and let the elastic band go and let it come back together and have that beautiful, this huge E major chord at the end. So those are my thoughts about the variations. It's a lot of information, but hopefully it makes sense. I'm sorry it's so dark in here. These lights are cursed and they're like bright LED lights. So I prefer not to have them on. So, but yeah, you can still see.
I understand the struggle. I'm still not sure whether or not to leave my window open or not at this point. It's like not quite dark enough that I need to close it, but
yeah.
But anyway, thank you very much.
And
That's very helpful.
Yeah. You're welcome, and you've learned. It's clear that you put in the effort to learn the piece, and it's clear that you have a good understanding of the piece, technically. And so now it's time to refine it musically, for sure. And that was a
Alright.
year ago. Not a year. That was about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and I'm sure that you'd play it even a lot better now. I'm sure of it.
I
Because I've
feel
been watching your
confident
videos
that
from
with
8 months
time
ago
it's
and
gotten
watching your videos now.
Right.
Yeah, and it'll continue to get better. I have no doubts.
Right.
So I'm opening the floor up to comments now. I'm gonna get a glass of water real quick, but I guess Josh, you always start, so go for it, Josh. I'm gonna get some water really quick. Excuse me.
I like how it's just become the expectation that I am the one that starts comments, as if like I am somehow more qualified, which I'm clearly not. But the I think he covered so much of what there is to cover here. I don't know how much you know about what Matt has done with this piece, but this is the first piece he learned on organ, which is a ridiculous thing to do. You don't just start organ and like, oh, I'm going to learn the Duruflé Vini Creator, and he learned it with David Durkop, who's below me on my screen. I don't know where. And so, and he told me that story, and it's very funny. But I think to summarize a lot of what he said and a lot of what I was thinking, it's just, it turns into a matter of just being more organic and natural with it, and stop trying to force the music to do things it's not already trying to do. It's not, you know, and you are far from the first American, and unfortunately you will be far from the last who tries to do this to this piece by turning it into this, oh, this is romantic, like, you know, it's really, not that much of a romantic piece if you think about it. It's really more kind of, it's far more related to kind of medieval, except using modern harmonies and stuff. And so the chant...
To that point, if I can say something. Yeah, for so long I've listened to this piece and other Duruflé pieces performed by all these American performers and all sorts of other situations, and they're great. They're wonderful to listen to. A while back I listened to, I think it was actually the prelude from the suite being played by Duruflé, and it amazed me just how different
it's a completely different world.
Of it was from all the recordings I'd heard. It was completely different, and it made sense to me. And like you said, it was very medieval feeling, because obviously that one's very based on chant, but the same things carry over to this one.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's definitely something that, since I've recorded this, I've become more aware of.
Yeah, I think it's important for all Duruflé, all the way from, you know, the Vini Creator, the Suite, the Requiem, all of it is tied into Gregorian themes. And so when you think about breathing and pacing and that sort of thing, you have to think about it in the context of what, you know, you would do if you were singing the actual chant melody, which obviously Matt talked about a ton. I think that was like most evident in the hymn at the beginning. I heard that and I'm like, okay, how am I supposed to sing with that? Because it really is a hymn. I don't know why these people, you know, play it. And yeah, I'm sure, you know, it obviously wasn't your idea to play it like that. I'm sure you picked it up somewhere. And I don't know why someone started doing that, because it's clear that this is just a chorale. It's like if you're playing the Bach partita on like Zeige Grüße or something, and it starts with just the setting of the hymn. And if you turned that into like, you know, a rubato laden like romantic something or another fantasy, all of a sudden the rest of the partita doesn't make any sense. And it's the same with this piece as well. This is sort of like a Bach partita, except it's a Duruflé set of variations. Yeah, I think he covered most of what there is to cover. About the scale going up to the climax, farther evidence that it should just lead directly into that chord without any slowing down. First of all, outside of Duruflé, you see similar motives all over, and like tons of music from all over the place. So, you know, comes to my mind the Reger D minor, the scale variations. You wouldn't slow down at the end of those scales. And then early on in the same piece by Duruflé, in the Adagio, you actually get very similar scales going into very similar chords at the end of the Adagio. You know, that same thing. A very, very similar idea. And no one plays that slowing down at the end of those scales, or at least I hope they don't. Now that I say that, I'm sure someone probably has. But anyway, yeah, that's... I don't have anything else to say. That's basically it.
Yeah. So,
Great.
yeah, I'm gonna ask. Hold on. I'm gonna ask two people their thoughts. Also, can I just say a big hello to Professor Craig Williams? It's been 2 years since I've seen you. Hello. It's wonderful to see you. I'm so glad you came. And I'm absolutely going to ask your thoughts. But I'm obliged to ask in the order I see people on the screen. So I'm going to ask Ian his thoughts. I'm going to ask David Durkop his thoughts, and then I'm going to ask Craig. But I would love to hear Ian's thoughts first, please.
Easy. I got nothing. Except I enjoyed it.
Okay. Fair enough.
You got me by surprise.
Yeah. Caleb, what do you want to say, bro?
You know, I played this. I made the mistake of attempting to play this piece, probably, God, nearly 4 years ago, and I made the executive decision that I was not musically mature enough to handle it. I think at that point, and now I think after hearing all this, I'm considering that it might be time to take another shot at it. But I think in terms of the critique of the performance, I agree kind of about the slowing down on that scale at the end, and some of the tempos throughout did feel a little fast. But I did want to commend you. You seem to handle the acoustic in that room really well. I don't know if it sounds dry when I listen to it. Maybe it's not. It could be a mic thing. But
I would say it is, and for reference, those mics are placed at the front of the church, and that organ is up in the balcony in the back. It's not an especially long church. It's almost as wide as it is long, but it is, I would say, a fairly dry acoustic. There's carpets on the floor and everything. Not like shag carpets or anything, but yeah.
Carpeting churches should be a punishable crime.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But yeah, your ability to handle that acoustic is actually quite impressive, I thought.
Well, thank you.
I don't know. I think that's mostly all I have. I really enjoy that. I can't remember the numbering of the variations now. Is it the fourth one, the Adagio, the slow one, or is that the third one?
It's the third variation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I remember the 2 against 3. I was never able to play that properly. That was terrible. I can snap out 4s against 5s, but I can't for the life of me play those 2 against 3s well. Anyway, there's a lot of depth to that piece. And all of Duruflé really. It's easy to overlook, and it's my experience with it was always when you pull out the sheet music, it looks easier than it sounds, and then you try to play it, and it's harder than it sounds. So it's a very...
That's pretty accurate, yeah.
Anyway, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you.
David, please give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the performance, and let me just share a little bit of autobiographical experience with this piece. I did the Prelude, Adagio, and Chorale Variations on my senior recital at Oberlin in 1978. I was a student of Bill Porter. Bill has just retired from teaching this past year. And I really thought Matthew's comments on the composition of the work were very, very interesting. But in this autobiographical perspective, after going to Oberlin to get my organ degree, I went to Carnegie Mellon to get a master's in conducting. And I studied with a gentleman who has recently passed. His name was Robert Page. And Bob Page was primarily a choral conductor, but he was also, for quite a few years, assistant conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, worked with Loren Moselle there. So he had quite a distinguished background. For one of my lessons with him, I brought him the Stravinsky Symphony of Psalms. And I told him how I was reading Walter Kraft's books on how to perform Stravinsky, and how I was listening to recordings to hear exactly how the composer would have done it, because of course the composer is the absolute last word on how to play his own music. Well, yeah, you kind of see where I'm leading. Robert Page said that, he said, I appreciate you reading Walter Kraft and listening to his recordings because he was Stravinsky's preferred conductor. But he said, the place where I disagree with Walter Kraft is this, that he said, when I get up to conduct, what the audience wants to hear is me. And he said, they want to hear a personal vision of the work. And he said, if you're going to try to copy the composer, it's not going to be authentic. And he said, I'm going to say something, David, to you very iconoclastic. He said, the composer is not always the best source of how to interpret the piece. And so getting back to the Duruflé, when I was in Oberlin, I got into a lot of trouble with my teacher because during the summers, I studied with a guy in Pittsburgh, a man in Pittsburgh, not famous, but somebody who had studied with Corboyne, who was the organist at Wanamaker's, and he studied also with Joseph Bonnet, who was a famous recitalist in the early parts of the 20th century. And Bill Wagner taught me a lot of rubato on the Veni Creator. And shockingly, Bill Porter let me do it when I played it on the Flentrop at Oberlin. And it was a very iconoclastic thing because really what I was doing was delivering a personal approach and not trying to copy the composer's recommendations about how to play the piece. I'm not saying that what Duruflé would have wanted is a bad thing, but I think what your audience wants to hear is you. And I think if you're going to try to copy the composer's recommendations, you might be passing up an opportunity to deliver something that's very spiritually unique and original to you. So the performance we just heard, I thought a lot of the rubato was very effective. And as I say, what Robert Page, my conducting professor, told me is that the composer is not always, sometimes, but not always the best source of information as to how to play the piece. That's just my presentation.
Thank you very much.
One comment.
Let me say something really quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just appreciate, this isn't anything super insightful, but this isn't, I just appreciate getting all these different takes about this piece because ultimately what matters is taking them all in and then evaluating them. So thank you for sharing that story about the piece as well. Very interesting.
When I talk, I'm making a point. When I talk, I'm putting my point into a bigger perspective. When I talk about my experiences and knowing what Duruflé wants, it is not copying exactly what the composer did because I have 3 recordings in my personal possession of Duruflé playing this at different points in his life. I have a recording of him playing it in 1940, I have a recording of him playing it in 1960, and another one in 1970. I have 3 recordings of him playing this. And it is not copying how the composer would have played it when I talk about those points. It is, and it's not copying anything. It's acknowledging what the piece is about and how I can achieve the best result of it from what I know about how the composer wrote the piece. I actually I don't think at least I don't do much of what any Duruflé or anything of what Duruflé did in his performance. Personally, I as a joking point, he was a big fan of rushing and getting drunk and missing notes. So it's not a personal thing of mine, but it's not. I don't see it as copying because I can give you another example. Both Daniel Barenboim and Andras Schiff, two of the probably greatest musicians alive, both share the same philosophy that I have, which I've learned immensely from Andras Schiff, from studying with Andras Schiff personally. And both of them have the same goal, which is to let the music to do exactly what's on the page, nothing more, and allow the music to transcend. But their own life experiences allow that music to transcend to different places. It's not a matter of copying, it's a matter of allowing the life experiences to help you transcend the music better rather than just copying. And both of them have the same goal. Both of them want to do absolutely nothing to the Schubert impromptu, just to use it again as an example. And both of them play it entirely differently, and both ways are immensely profound and beautiful. So it's not about necessarily copying, but it's about transcending to a different place based on your life experiences. But that's just wanted to talk about that for a second. Greg Williams, I would love to know your point. I know your thoughts on this. I love this discussion.
If I may be
That's
allowed to
wonderful.
start with a Walter Kraft story. Is everyone here familiar with the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini by Sergei Rachmaninoff, and especially the iconic 18th variation, the beautiful D flat, da dee da da da. Anyway, when Leonard Rose unfortunately passed away, I was a student at Juilliard at the time, a piano student. And I'm blanking on the name of the cellist who took over after Professor Rose passed away. But he had some wonderful, wonderful stories of when he was playing in an orchestra. And this cellist was playing in the LA Philharmonic summer of 1942 in the Hollywood Bowl. And this was during the Second World War. And you think of Hollywood, you think of LA, the lights had to be down for the most part. The Hollywood Bowl that seats several thousand people had to be limited to just a couple of thousand. They had to keep the lights down because they never knew about the air raids or anything like this. So this is 1942. It was the year before Rachmaninoff passed away in Beverly Hills, and he was the performer. He was the pianist. The conductor was Walter Kraft. Now, what's interesting is the orchestra practiced their part of the piece the day before the pianist arrived. Walter Kraft's interpretation, not saying being beholden to the composer of the 18th variation, was ba 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 ba. Okay, very, very Teutonic. And meanwhile, people in the orchestra are like going, oh my God, you know, because Rachmaninoff is coming the next day, and Rachmaninoff had a legendary temperament, let's say. So anyway, Rachmaninoff shows up the next day. They go into the 18th variation, and of course it starts with the orchestra and then the piano. So he just goes da 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 da. Anyway, he said the pianist did not say a word, did not move a muscle. It's that when it came time for the piano to come in, Rachmaninoff just did it his inimitable way, and somehow Kraft did it his way, and there was no two words. And they found out later that the fireworks had happened in Philadelphia 2 or 3 years previous. Anyway, so that's just a little story about Walter Kraft and interpreting something beyond the composer, and you can determine whether that's superior or not. Okay, but anyway, so that's just an aside. I also think that anyone who's going to play the Duruflé theme varie has to be commended, and so wonderful work, you know, with all that. It really, again, a lot of wonderful preparation. What I would say is that what you're now ready to do, I'm just going to give a couple practical considerations because a lot has already been said tonight, a lot to digest. I've actually learned a lot just listening. This has been wonderful. But so the two practical considerations I would give is this. I can't speak to rubato. I can't speak to a lack of rubato. What I can say, what I was hearing with your playing, was that I was hearing a lot of the chant melody. I was hearing a lot of the interplay of the canonic voices, but with your decision to kind of move things forward, I don't think I had heard yet that you had internalized the other music that had been written yet. It was almost as if you were just kind of going through. So the practical consideration, and maybe you've already been doing this, what I would ask you to do when you take that metronome, the way that Matt has asked you to do, is I would actually sit down and deliberately practice the movement without the melodic parts. Actually practice the counter parts with the metronome so that at the least you get what the composer has on the page and learn, as Matt suggested, to sing those parts and ignore the Veni Creator theme for now, except when it shows up in the triplets, because you got to practice the triplets. But I would practice all the parts that are not the melody right now, because you know the melody, cool. Actually learn to love those parts and sing those parts. And then when you've made your musical universe with those parts, then reintroduce the Veni Creator. And even then, don't make the Veni Creator the most important thing. Allow it naturally to fold on to what's newly become important. And then see where that blend and that mix, where that ends up. Because that may actually then get you to because now you're not following the Veni Creator. Now the Veni Creator is actually allowed to sit on top of this tapestry, this world that Duruflé is creating. Then when you fully understood that, then you can go as rubato as you want. I mean, if that's really what you want to do, even though I personally would not do that also. Because I think you'll find that the rubato is already written in with what he's got. Going back to the prelude that was mentioned too, the beautiful thing about what Duruflé writes in the prelude and writes in so many of his other pieces is that when he writes expressif versus when he writes très expressif versus when he writes sostenuto versus when he writes various other, you know, instructions. Now he's giving you permission to be expressive. Now he wants you to be very expressive. Now he wants you to be chanté. Now he wants you to sing, okay? So he wants you to sing here. He wants you to be expressive there, very expressive there, just sostenuto there. And then most importantly, many, many sections where there's nothing. And my sense is that when he's not giving one of those specific instructions that he's got nothing, then give it nothing. Because when you give it nothing, then when you do get the instruction, it shows that contrast so much more. And also, then you get to show the variation. Then you get to show what's the difference between expressif versus très expressif versus chanté. So that's one thing that I ran a student of mine through with that prelude. You know, he got to a part that was marked piano, and I said, "Why is the box shut?" Still have a pianissimo you have to get to. You have to look at the varying degrees of dynamic, the varying degrees of expression, and also see what he has there. And then one other, so that's basically what I have to say about that. The other practical consideration I would say too about the repeated notes and about playing with perhaps with the hip and the ankle. Just be very, very careful when you use the hip. Because when you're 58 years old like me, you got to be real careful about the way you use your hips and knees, okay? I'm just saying. All right, not that my ankles are in that great a shape either, but the key to playing the repeated notes, even with the hands and the feet, and you may be doing this already, is that when you lift the pedal, Don't allow the sole of the shoe to leave the wood. So when you lift the pedal, stay in contact with the pedal before you reapply it. Okay, so the release and the reapplication of the notes can actually be done while you're still in contact with the key, and you'll find that your control is increased 300-fold. But once you lift the foot off of the pedal, now you got to come in for a landing, quote unquote, okay? And you've lost all expressive control. So the releases should be done while you're still, and the same thing playing with the keys with the hands. Sometimes when you have the repeated notes, sometimes be very careful when you want it to be expressive. Don't release all the way, but actually keep the thing. You can release a note and yet still feel the plastic or ivory or whatever that key is underneath your fingertip. And so the releases very practically can be done while you're still in contact. And I think you'll find you have much more control, and also the sound of the reapplied note is that much warmer, that much more pleasant. But once you lift it, and then now you've got to jump back on, okay, it's literally you've now lost your center of gravity, and now you almost have to come back, press the note first, and then reapply, and you've already added about 6 or 7 steps to what very simply should be a release, reapply, release. By the way, you notice I never use the word attack. I'm sorry. I know that's common courtesy, but I don't like that word. All right, so I just the application of the key or whatever, or wherever you want to call it, stroking the key, however that is. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents is in terms of the releases, and then also really learning those inner voices as well as that veni creator melody. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much.
Matt kind of wanted me to say something, sort of on the subject that Dr. Durkop brought up, and it's fascinating because I think there could be some sort of language barrier here in some way, because I spend a lot of time with Matt when I'm at school, and I know, based on my interactions with him and from what I am, I don't, as a musician, I don't want the things we say to be interpreted as discouraging of individuality, because that's not something we want at all. What's the purpose of having multiple organists in the world if we all play the same? Clearly, there is room for vast arrays of difference in how we play. But I think what we're really talking about is which level of the music we insert ourselves in. And it's different, like, depending on which composers you're playing. For some composers, it makes perfect sense to inject yourself into the music at the kind of surface level and fiddle with it. And Bach is a perfect example, because Bach did very little in the way of phrase markings or articulation markings or anything like that. And so, as a musician, you kind of have to figure out what you are going to do to it at the very surface and then work your way down from there. Or start at the bottom and work your way up, either way, but at some point you as a musician are going to have to be playing with the surface. But when a composer like Duruflé specifies what he wants at the surface, which really these slurs and articulation markings and expressive markings, all of those are what I would refer to as surface level markings. You could program a robot to follow those markings. But what that means is that what you do as an interpreter of the music has to be at levels underneath that you have to simultaneously leave intact the surface level guides that kind of keep you in the right direction that the composer puts there. And your sense of individuality, your kind of spiritual sense of individuality, has to connect at the spiritual level of the piece, which is far farther below all of that, is kind of what we were talking about. And so part of that is that it has to be kind of natural. I kind of thought of the analogy of kind of injection molding, that when we're playing Duruflé, we as musicians are not in the business of injection molding ourselves into the, into the music, because that's very forceful. And I think that if we just play, and it has to do again with kind of playing the notes versus playing the music. When we say just play, we're not talking about just the notes, but we're talking about getting rid of anything that separates kind of the spiritual things that you have inside yourself and the spiritual things that are already in the music. Getting rid of any barrier between those is what it means to just play. And so, by nature, if you just play, as in you open up your spirit to the spirit of the music, if you do that, then it will become individual. But it's not a result of effort to make it individual, it just happens. And it results in this very beautiful and profound sense in the music. And actually, it's interesting because, you know, I just thinking about, like, myself and Matt, I think that he would agree that at any pieces that the two of us have both played, I don't think he would argue that we play them completely differently most of the time. And yet, in some ways, our philosophy, our approach to the music isn't that different. And so, starting with not doing anything other than just playing, we arrive at completely different, either core understandings of the piece, or at least different kind of, at least it sounds different, it expresses something different. And so, when we apply these kind of thoughts to Duruflé or to Chopin, to just play means that in some ways the bit of yourself that you put into the music is a far deeper bit of yourself than just crafting the music into something that is yours. Because at that point, you're not really crafting the music into something that's yours. You're kind of, you and the music are kind of becoming the same thing, if that makes sense. It's sort of a kind of abstract way of thinking, but yeah, I just didn't want you to think that, you know, we're discouraging individuality, because individuality is essential. It's just that our way of doing it, especially when it comes to something like Duruflé, is kind of it has to be organic and natural and not fiddling with the surface, because the surface will fix itself when you just kind of eliminate the barriers between the spirit inside you and the spirit inside the music. So that's kind of what my thoughts are on that, and I can't speak for Matt, but I think that's probably kind of the direction that he was taking it as well. Do you have a response for that, Matt?
I was just listening. I'm more curious to see if David has a response to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess for most of the years that I have been playing organ, I have had a personal response to what I was taught as a student of a very distinguished professor at Oberlin, whom I really disagreed with a lot. And I think that that's kind of a little bit of what I'm expressing. I love to phrase, and I love to shape phrases, and I love to see the spiritual meaning, the picture of the coming of the Holy Spirit, all these things expressed in the music. I just have heard so many performances of Duruflé that are very they're just too steady for me, and I like the rubato. But it doesn't have to be that way. My way is not the only way to do it. But that's kind of where I'm coming from. It is a lot of what I reflected in my own playing is a response to what I was taught when I was an Oberlin student during the 70s. And it is a profound disagreement with that school of thought. But it doesn't mean that the way I would play something is the only way to do it, and I don't feel that way.
And just to clarify, what is that school of thought that you adamantly disagree with? Just to be like super clear about
Well, it seemed like when I was a student at Oberlin, what I was taught was that Duruflé's own preference for the performance of his works was to not use rubato. And it's been said that Duruflé is the last impressionist. Well, I mean, if you listen to Debussy and Ravel, I mean, how how's their music interpreted? And you listen to this beautiful, expressive music of Vaughan Williams, these orchestral, lush orchestral works. I just have felt that maybe there are other ways to play Duruflé than what some of the opinions have been expressed. That's what I think.
Can I didn't say anything about this because I've been listening and absorbing. I'm particularly someone who's just getting into Duruflé as a performer or player or learning it. It's been very instructive to get all of these different views. I come back to my comment, the first comment I made about my performance and my recording, that I need to feel as a performer like I own it, I understand it, and it owns me. So, that echoes a couple of these comments. That the one thing that I don't want to do is just play it the way other people play it, or just play it the way that I've been told. Simply because that's just the way it is. And the masterclass has been useful for me because it's uncovered a couple of things that I've unconsciously been doing, partly because of what I'm hearing, and then I adjust my playing to what I'm hearing, but that also has to be adjusted against my conception of how it should be played, my inner ear. And I think the most useful thing for me out of this masterclass and all of this has been to be consciously reflecting on all of these aspects. So I make conscious decisions as a performer and as a player, as opposed to just, playing it however someone has told me to play it, or just copying it off somebody else's recording. So I kind of thank everyone for that.
Well, I mean, that's the main reason that Josh and I had the idea to start this thing back in February was that even if we disagreed with them, I mean, I've invited plenty of people who are going to come and people who haven't had the opportunity to come yet. Which I keep it down low because I don't want to get people's hopes up in case they can't. But there's a lot of great people who are still going to come, and I guarantee you that every single person who comes, Josh and I, the people people started the server, I guarantee you 100%, without a doubt, there is something that we adamantly disagree on with the person who's speaking. The point of this is not only to help musicians get better, to say it at a very shallow level, but also to get different perspectives of not only music but life and how that evolves into music. And so, if you're not getting multiple perspectives from this place, then it's not doing its job. So that makes me feel good as someone who's trying to put effort in this place. That's the reason I ask everyone I can, who I respect as a musician, to come into here and to teach, because they offer valuable feedback from their lives that Craig can't tell you what David can, and David can't tell you what Craig can, and Josh can't tell you what Owen can, and I can't tell you what Owen can, and Owen can't tell you what I can. We all have different perspectives on life, and the whole point of this place is to get that flowing into this one big conscious stream, if I can call that, of information, to where you can take out bits and pieces that work for you. So that's the point of this place. So I'm glad it's working then. That makes me feel good. I'm sure it makes Josh feel good too. Do you have a response to that, Josh? I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I totally agree. It's wonderful to hear perspectives, and I actually really enjoy hearing perspectives that I disagree with because it makes me think, and I like thinking. And sometimes it makes me change my mind, and other times it doesn't, but it makes me come up with a better reason to support my idea when I hear something I disagree with. It forces me to... So at any rate, hearing things I disagree with forces me to think. And hearing things I agree with, but expressed from a completely different point of view, also makes me think. And that's the whole goal of this thing, is to kind of... It's to make kind of... There are other places to learn how to play instruments. Obviously, doing that in person with primary instructors is the way to do that. But what we're trying to do is to really encourage thinking among musicians, which is sort of what's lacking the most in the youngest generation, because just like was the true, 20, 50, 90, 150 years ago, they're being exposed to one point of view, which is dominating their, overall education. And if we broaden, if we kind of expose people to a broader range of perspectives, it helps them figure out exactly what they are as a musician and how to best convey that through their music. So I think it's wonderful to, have conversations like this, because it really helps me feel like the server is doing its job, because, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Dr. Durkop and I will always have different approaches to music at some level, and that's good, because there's room in the world for both of us to play in our ways, and it makes the world more interesting that we can both do it. And so it's sort of a blessing that, we have the internet as a resource to be able to do things like this. Yeah, just basically all I have to say.
Well, that having been said, this has been one of the quickest 2 hours and 40 minutes in my entire life. I'll say that right now. It's just like I just glanced at the clock for the first time, thinking it was at maybe 8:30, and it's 9:38. So, I apologize for the aspect of keeping it going, but I think, if I may assert my judgment, that was a very well worth it time spent on music, and I'm really happy to have this conversation going with you guys. I thank David and Owen and everyone else, Craig Williams especially, Josh, everyone here for coming, for giving their perspectives, and um, we do have some great teachers lined up for the coming months. I'll keep you guys posted on that as they come per week. And if I know concretely that someone's coming on a certain date, I'll put that in the announcements channel as well. Um, and as you've seen over the past day, the server has already grown 6 or 7 people, and it's going to continue to grow because Josh and I have hatched a plan, and the hidden mysterious channels that you guys can't see in the administration channels. We have some mysterious plans going on to grow the server immensely. So I look forward to doing that. And with that having been said, I thank you all for coming so much, and it was great to see you. So